So just to kind of recap, all right, is in example 1, we started off with y equals 2x plus 3. Then we kind of went through this process here, except for that we didn't do 3 and 4 yet. So we went through this process, and then we ended up with x equals y minus 3 over 2. There were some observations that could be made on this equation over here. We multiplied by 2 and we added by 3. However, on this equation, we subtracted by 3 and then we divided by 2. So we did inverse operations, but we also did it in the opposite order, in the inverse or reverse order. And so since we did them in the inverse order and opposite operations, we would say that the second one, or you could label both these functions as inverse functions. So then the last step to making an inverse function is, if you look at this equation, I have an x and I have a y, and then it says to write your inverse function. This is the last step, to write your inverse function. You just swap the x and y. So here you had x equals y minus 3. Over here you have y equals x minus 3. And then the last thing would be is that you would label this as f inverse of x equals x minus 3 all over 2. Okay? And so I wrote this down too. So really, to find the inverse, what did we do in that process? Well, we substituted y for f of x, right? That was the first thing we did. If we go back here, the first thing we did is we went from f of x to y, all right? And then what was the next thing we did? Well, then you solve for x and got x equals some stuff. So this is the x equals some stuff that we got. And then lastly, we switched x and y. So here we had an x and here we had a y. Then we switched the x and y's. Now we have the y's here and the x's here. And the last thing for finding the inverse function is wherever there's a y, we're going to plug in f raised to the negative 1. That's really, and I wrote this down here. Make sure you have this written down in your notebooks. And we're going to write this down a lot. So let me explain something to you. When I write this down, and I ask you guys to write it down in your notes, some of you will say, I'm not going to write it down. I wrote it down once. Then I'm going to give you a test in a couple of days, and you won't know or remember that you wrote it down in your book, in your notebook. And so you won't remember these steps. There's just no way. I don't have enough time to keep going over and over and over it. You can't learn it that way. You're going to have to read your notes. You're going to have to write it down. So what I like to do is write it down so you hear it, see it, say it, right? Because you got to say it in your head to write it down. You need to write all this little information down in your notes. Don't choose to not write it down, because you're really studying for the test. That's how you learn it, okay? So anyways, last part of this deal is to understand the relationship of these inverses and what kind of clues do we have that can help us. So I'm going to go to the next. Can I go to the next page? Does everybody have this written down? Yeah, is there anybody that needs to wait? Okay, let's go to the next page. Oops, wrong one. So the last thing that we need to do, and then this is it for the day, and I'll explain what all this means. The last thing we need to do is understand the relationship. So if I graph, and I'm just going to point this out, if I graph f, right, so this is f, and I just don't try to frantically, I'm going to leave this up and you'll have plenty of time to write it down, but just watch what I'm doing here. This is the original function y equals 2x, was it plus 3? Yeah. Dang it. All right, and then our inverse function that we found right here, this is f inverse of x, and that equals x minus 3 over 2. And maybe for good measure, I should write down the formal notation. I should write it down as f of x. And then right in the middle, we have this little line right here that's y equals x. Okay? Notice that they're symmetrical about that line. This line is the mirror image. In other words, this blue line, if I flip it over this diagonal of y equals x, I'll get the red line. That's how you could tell they're inverse functions. And then lastly, notice on my top line I have -2, -1, 0, 1, 2. That just switches with the y values, and I have -2, -1, 0, 1, 2. Same thing over here. My y values become -1, 1, 3, 5, 7. Over here it's -1, 1, 3, 5, 7. All right? So what does that mean? Now you can start writing it down. The inverse functions can be denoted by f raised to the first, is kind of how you guys might think about it, but really it's read as f inverse. Because the inverse function switches the input and output values of the function, the domain and range are also switched too. Right? The domain and range are also switched too. So the graph of f of x, or f inverse, is the reflection of the graph of f across the line y equals x. This is true for all inverses. So if you want to, in other words, if you want to double check your inverse on your homework, just graph the original function and the inverse function and y equals x. And there should be a mirror image across that diagonal line. Okay? I'll leave that up there for a second. Are there any questions? Okay.